So last week we talked about energy and how energy enters an ecosystem. And we found out that almost all the energy on Earth comes from the sun, and it enters the Earth through photosynthesis. Photosynthesis was when plants take sunlight, they take carbon dioxide from the air, and they turn that into sugars, into a physical thing. And then from there, that sugar, which is storing the energy, is cycled through a food web by different plants and animals eating each other. There's also other cycles that happen, and we call these ones the nutrient cycles, right? That was dealing with energy. Now we're going to deal with matter. So we're going to talk about the water cycle and the carbon cycle. All right, so on the Earth, matter is recycled. Remember that matter is all of the atoms that are making up the Earth and the plants and the animals, right? Matter is something that takes up space and it has mass. It weighs something. So all of the matter, all of the Earth and the plants and the animals is recycled. So those nutrients are continually reused. When a plant dies, the atoms eventually they break apart and they're used by other things, right? Some of them are eaten, some of them break apart, some of them are stored in the ground, but eventually they're used in something else. Those atoms don't disappear when a plant dies. Nutrients are elements that are needed to make either food, proteins, or cells. So they're something that a plant or an animal needs to survive. And the four main nutrients needed for life on Earth are carbon. All of the plants and animals on Earth are based on carbon. So carbon chains make up many of the atoms in our bodies, or many of the molecules in our bodies. Also hydrogen, right? Remember that's the simplest element. Hydrogen is part of water. Oxygen is also part of water, right? So those are crucial elements. And also nitrogen. These are the four main nutrients that are allowing life to survive on Earth. And if we look at a periodic table, right, hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, these are relatively small, basic elements. And these are just elements, types of atoms on the periodic table. All right, so these different atoms, they're cycled through plants and animals and the atmosphere, right, the air and the ground, the lithosphere, and they continually cycle through that for millions or billions of years. For example, hydrogen, all of the hydrogen in the universe, almost all of it was created at the beginning of the universe. So over 13 billion years ago, it was created shortly after the Big Bang. And those are the same hydrogen atoms that are around today. They're the same hydrogen atoms that are in the food you eat and in your body. Most of these atoms are formed within stars. Stars get hot enough that they can create some of the larger atoms, like the carbon and the oxygen and the nitrogen. So they're created in stars billions of years ago, and then they continue to cycle through the Earth and the living systems on the Earth. All right, so let's start by looking at the water cycle. So water is used in many life processes, and it makes up about 60% of your body is just water. Right, remember water, H2O, that's where that hydrogen and that oxygen is coming in. All right, so let's go through and fill in this diagram. All right, so a couple spots to fill in. We're going to start down here with the ocean. So the ocean, the lakes, the rivers, those are stores of water, right? They are keeping water there for, in the ocean, possibly a very long time that it just stays there, right? Now, when sunlight hits the ocean, it warms it up. And if we think back to our chemistry unit, when a material warms up, the atoms start to move faster, they start to move further apart, and if you warm them up enough, eventually this liquid water will turn into a gas. And we call that evaporation. So sunlight warms up the surface of the ocean. Eventually it gets hot enough that it's turning into a gas. And now that water has left the ocean, it's left its liquid state and it's turned into a gas state in the atmosphere. If you think about a plant also has water within it, right? If you've looked at a plant on a really hot day, you'll notice it's kind of drooping, right? Because it doesn't have enough water. But you water it, and maybe an hour later, that water has entered into the plant, and now it's quite a bit stiffer. Now, that water that's within the plant will also evaporate over time. We call that transpiration. So that's the loss of water through the plant's leaves, for example. So that will also allow another avenue for water to change from a liquid state within the plant into the atmosphere as a gas. Now that that water is in the atmosphere, eventually, once you get enough of it, it will condense. So it'll go up into the atmosphere, and eventually you'll get these clouds that will form, and the water molecules will condense together, and you'll get these clumps, and eventually, once you get enough of it, you will get liquid again. Right? So you will get precipitation. Right? So it might be rain, right? Or if it's cold enough, you might get snow or hail. So precipitation allows that gas form, right? It condenses back together into a liquid, or if it's cold enough, a solid, and precipitation allows that to now fall back to the earth. If it's snow, if it's high up in a mountain, it might even be stored for a while, right? So if you look up at a mountain, even during the summer, sometimes you'll see these white-capped mountains. You'll see this snow on the mountains or ice, and that's also storing some of the water. That precipitation will then run downhill, right? Or over time it will slowly melt. Some of it will sink into the ground, and some of it is called surface runoff. Right? So eventually, either through the ground or by running, back through ocean or through lakes and rivers, it'll eventually reach its way back to the ocean. And you'll notice this cycle then continues. So in this case, it's the same water molecules throughout this whole cycle, right? If you looked at a single water molecule here, it would eventually get evaporated and travel up into the atmosphere, and then eventually through rain it would fall back to the Earth's surface and travel downhill and eventually make its way back to the ocean. And that might take quite a while, but it is the exact same water molecule that's doing this. And that would continue over and over and over again. What's powering this cycle? Well, it's the sun. Right? The sun is providing the energy to cause evaporation and cause this cycle to keep going and going and going. And all of the living things on Earth rely on this cycle continuing. Right? Without the cycle, you wouldn't have rivers or lakes. Right? It would eventually become very barren and dry. So all of the plants and animals that are living anywhere relies on this cycle continuing. All right, let's look at the next cycle. Next cycle is the carbon cycle. So now we're looking at carbon atoms, right? So carbon also cycles through the atmosphere and the organisms and the ground. And it cycles through those by photosynthesis and by cellular respiration. Right, so hold on, what were those things again? Let's go back and look at our lesson from last week. Photosynthesis, that's where plants were taking sunlight, carbon dioxide out of the air, and water, and they were turning those into glucose, sugar, and oxygen. So the plants are taking carbon dioxide out of the air, carbon, and they are turning it into glucose, which has carbon in it. So a sugar molecule, a sugar molecule has a bunch of carbon atoms in it. So that's how that carbon is going from the atmosphere into plants, into a solid. Right, so in this case, photosynthesis is allowing carbon to go from the atmosphere into plants into a solid. Cellular respiration, this was when plants or animals will take that sugar and break it back down, and they'll get the energy out of it. And you'll notice that that now takes the carbon from a solid form and puts it back into carbon dioxide, into a gas. All right, so we'll look at the cycle in a second, but first of all, let's look at where is some of this carbon stored. Okay, so some of the carbon is just stored in the atmosphere. The atmosphere naturally has carbon dioxide in it. There's carbon dioxide in the air right now. You're breathing carbon dioxide out into the air. And it's stored there for some time, and it's used by plants in order to do photosynthesis. So I mean, it's important to have at least some carbon in the atmosphere so that plants can continue to do photosynthesis. Without it, plants wouldn't be able to survive. Also the oceans. So the oceans will dissolve a bunch of carbon, and that allows algae to grow. So algae, like the tiny green plants in the ocean and in lakes. So those are also plants, and those are also doing photosynthesis. And a significant amount of the carbon is being brought in through algae, and also other aquatic plants. So the oceans store a huge amount of carbon. It naturally gets dissolved into the water, and then it can be used by plants, aquatic plants. Also on the earth, so in the organisms, the plants and animals, and also the lithosphere, in the rocks and the soil that are making up the earth. And also in the Earth's crust. So it naturally becomes part of sedimentary rocks. So for example, limestone or fossil fuels like coal and oil and natural gas. So those things are all made out of carbon. Fossil fuels are formed by taking a carbon-based object like a plant or an animal, and eventually if it gets compressed underground for long enough, 10,000 years, eventually it gets compressed so much that it forms into coal or oil or natural gas. When we're talking about the limestone here, sorry. This is a picture of the White Cliffs of Dover. So these are limestone cliffs that are in Britain. And these cliffs, you can so the color of them there is the kind of what gives it away is that they're made out of limestone. It's the same thing that chalk is made out of. And limestone contains a significant amount of carbon. So these cliffs, we call them a carbon sink because they store carbon as a solid form. All right, so let's look at the cycle now. A few spots to fill in. All right, so once again, this cycle does rely on the sun because photosynthesis is what's bringing carbon from the atmosphere into a solid plant, right? So without the sunlight, this cycle can't occur. The sunlight's providing the energy that allows that to happen. All right, so it really starts with photosynthesis. Photosynthesis, carbon dioxide is being turned into glucose, into sugar. The carbon goes from the atmosphere into a solid. Now, what happens when a plant dies, right? Let's say you have a tree that dies. Well, when a tree dies, eventually it starts to decay, it breaks down, and as a plant or an animal is decaying, it will release that carbon back into the atmosphere. If that gets trapped underground, for example, if that tree and that animal, if its body gets trapped underground and it gets compressed, and it continues to get compressed over time, over 10,000 years, eventually it might form into fossil fuels, right? So now you get these deposits of coal and oil. or eventually into limestone possibly. So we get this carbon that's stored in the ground. Now, naturally, that carbon would stay there for a very long time, but since the Industrial Revolution, humans are now taking that carbon out of the ground really fast, right? They're mining coal, oil, natural gas, much faster than it would normally escape from the ground. Now, when we burn coal and natural gas, it releases that carbon, right? So it's no longer stored, and it's now an emission from, a factory or from an automobile, and it's released back into the atmosphere. Right? There's our carbon in the atmosphere. Now remember that some carbon in the atmosphere is okay, but human activity is releasing much more than would normally be released. Now that's not the only path, right? That's the human's path that's causing this to occur faster. Um, Carbon naturally goes back by animal respiration and also cellular respiration by plants. So when humans breathe, we are releasing carbon dioxide. Where does that come from? Well, it comes from us breaking down the sugars, right? Doing cellular respiration. And also naturally from fires. Right? That's also a natural cycle that brings some carbon back into the atmosphere. And, without the human emissions, normally the cycle would just continue on its way, and generally it's been balanced for a very long time, and that allows life on Earth, right? But by adding this human element into it, we're continuing, or we're starting to kind of unbalance that cycle. Right? So we'd say by burning fossil fuels, we're releasing large amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This increases the greenhouse effect, which is causing rapid climate change. Now, once again, we could follow a single carbon atom, and you could follow it throughout this cycle. So for example, you could look at a single carbon atom, and it would eventually be taken, let's say it's in the atmosphere, it's in the air. It has carbon dioxide in the air. Eventually, it would be taken in by a plant and turned into a sugar molecule. Eventually, that sugar molecule might be eaten by an animal, by a human, let's say, and it would become part of that human. Eventually, that human might breathe out and release that carbon back into the atmosphere. Or another possibility, maybe that carbon atom is brought into a plant by photosynthesis, turned into a sugar molecule. That plant then dies and it gets compressed underground. That carbon atom is stored in the ground for 10,000 years, turns into a piece of coal. That coal is then dug up and burnt, and now that carbon atom is released back into the atmosphere. But it's the same carbon atom. And it would now continue to do that cycle again. So there's kind of a famous question that you can ask where people will say, is there a carbon atom of Shakespeare in you? Maybe, maybe not, right? But all of the carbon atoms that were in Shakespeare's body are still in this cycle somewhere. Those carbon atoms are not being created or destroyed. They're just being moved into a different molecule, rearranged into a different molecule, but they continue to cycle and cycle and cycle.